for liberty and prosperity. And by the way, one of the things we've done is, I don't know if any of you have seen it on Facebook, on social media, and on radio ads, we wanted to bring the message of Richard Summers beyond the small group here, beyond the mural, beyond the statue. Because when you get to the real story of Richard Summers, you realize that it touches on so many things that affect our day-to-day lives today. From the war on terror, and by the way, if you would read the letters and arguments made at the time, almost identical to the arguments in Congress today over how to handle the war on terror or the war in Iraq or in the Middle East or with ISIS. Word for word, do we have the ability to defeat them? Should we make peace with them? Should we try to pay them and give them what they want? Identical arguments, and when you understand the story of Richard Summers, you understand what we're doing right and wrong today. Also, with the whole idea of what America was like back then, and when you go into the details of what Richard Summers, how not just him, but that whole generation of Americans, the first generation who grew up after the American Revolution, you say, my God, this is a remarkable story. How come our kids don't learn about this in high school? Why aren't there movies about this? Why aren't there miniseries? Why is it Mainland High School called Richard Summers High School? Things like that. And then when you think about that, the answer is obvious. George Orwell, the guy who wrote Animal Farm in 1984, had a good way of putting it. He talked about the power of history. He said, he who controls the past controls the future. And he who controls the present controls the past. So if you say that everything that happened in America, people who got rich in America got rich because of slavery, or stealing land from Indians, or from being violent or brutal or oppressive, if you think that that was what America used to be, then you'd want to fundamentally change America today. But if you understand some of the good and decent things that were done by people like Richard Summers and his entire class, then you would say, you know, America was founded as a good country, and we ought to preserve some of the values that they had. So you see, we're not just talking about ancient history. In understanding the Richard Summers story, we're understanding what we as Americans should be doing today. Now, just one interesting thing about Richard Summers growing up. What was the America like? Obviously, you didn't have any slavery here in Atlantic County or Egg Harbor Township. The Indians were here, but they didn't live here. They just came here for summer vacation to go fishing and clamming. Then they went back to Virginia and Maryland. But yet, Americans at that time were becoming very wealthy. And how did they do it? Ironically, the people who give the best explanation are the Hessian German soldiers who were sent in the American Revolution to fight the Patriots. After the war, 5,000 of those German mercenary soldiers hired to be with the British and to fight the Americans, they didn't want to go home. They stayed here. They did not go back to Germany. And when they would write letters back home as to why they stayed, what was so special about America, they invented a phrase in German called America is das Land der unbegrenzten Möglichkeiten. America is the land of boundless opportunities. And that land, America, land of boundless opportunities, stuck. And you see it with like Richard Summers growing up. You know, we say, oh, he only has an 8th grade education. But back in the days of Richard Summers, it was normal. You started school at about age 10. You finished at age 16. 8 years of education, and you knew more math, more science, more reading, more writing, more history, more literature than most kids graduating college today. Kids like Richard Summers, they had their summers off, but it was not a summer vacation. You worked at your family farm, or you worked on your family boat. You learned a trade with your family. So that by time a kid like Richard Summers was 16 years old, he was ready for the world with a trade and an education. And then, as the first speaker said, he went on to move up to become a mate, then a captain, and he was sailing ships, cargo ships from New York to Philadelphia by age 17 and 18, commanding a crew. And so this is what Americans were like. And had Richard Summers pursued that career, he'd probably been one of the, would have made enough money being a sea captain to be wealthy and living in one of those big houses in Linwood on Maple Avenue, or maybe having a farm in Egg Harbor Township, or maybe even living in Philadelphia, comfortable, married at the age of 30, because that was the unlimited opportunity Americans had back then. But he did. He took a different direction. At age 20, he joined the Navy. And there's a very interesting Summer. I don't know if he's here, but Bill Kelly is a fantastic Summers Point personality, a historian. And he wrote a fascinating piece about John Barry. Because you see, John Barry was the hero of the American Revolution Navy. You always think of, at least I always did, of John Paul Jones as the father of the American Navy, the guy who said, "I have not yet begun to fight." Well, yeah, he was a hero, but John Barry was just as much of a hero, except that John Barry was in it for the long term. And when the war was over, John Barry knew that if America was going to be a safe and decent country, it had to have a Navy to protect Americans overseas. Because at that time, Americans were going all over the world, carrying the grain and whiskey and dried fish and lumber, all the goods America was producing, would make a fortune taking it to Europe. And then in Europe, they'd buy China and finished goods and factory goods, perfumes, and bring it back here. So they'd make lots of money going both ways. That's how they became wealthy. But if these pirates, and that's another term, pirates would catch them, they'd hold them for ransom, and at the time, America did not have a Navy. 10% of the federal budget was being used to pay off those four kingdoms in North Africa. And then you may say, well, what gave them the nerve to do that? And then you get into a history that is totally missing from our U.S. history books, totally missing from our world history books. And that is the 1400-year battle between Muslims and Christians in Europe and the Middle East. In other words, 1400 years ago, Islam was a little religion on the Arabian Peninsula. Within 50 years, that small group of Muslim warriors had wiped out basically the Christian communities in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, Spain, and Portugal. And then you had the Crusades to fight them back. And then the Turks came along. And the Turks almost, they had an expression that a Christian could not float a plank in the Mediterranean when the Muslims had taken over. And it was true. And there were bitter battles with the Turks in the 1500s, Lepanto. And then, you know, the term September 11th. Anyone knows why September 11th has significance in the Muslim world? September 11th, 1683 is when the Muslim Turks blew up the walls of Vienna and were about to overrun all of Europe. September 12th was the day that the Catholic Polish cavalry pushed them back. And so for about 100 years after that, the whole 1700s, you had a sort of a stalemate between Christian Europe and the Muslim Turks. And that's what America stumbled into. So there's a little difference of opinion. I wouldn't call them the mafia. There was really a jihad going on. And the European Christians weren't strong enough to stop the Turks. The Turks weren't strong enough to take the Christians. So you had this sort of borderline skirmishing in which the Turks would say, we're the moderates. We're at peace with you, and we can't control these radical Tripolians, or we can't control these radical Tunisians or Algerians. You know, they're causing all this trouble. But it's fascinating when you read the stories, you'll see that these, and by the way, they call them pirates, but they weren't pirates, you see, because a pirate is an outlaw, a criminal. And if you caught a pirate, they'd be immediately executed as a criminal. But you see, these Muslim kingdoms would declare war on these Christian countries that would not pay them tribute. So if you captured them, they would demand to be treated as prisoners of war under international law, and they were protected. And I just enjoyed reading Chip Reed's book, Intrepid Sailors. All sorts of games and loopholes were played back then. So if a Tripoli ship, and they weren't pirates, they were called privateers, where the French word was called corsair. Corsair is the French word for privateer, meaning you worked on your own, but if you caught the enemy ship, you'd have to give like 1/4 of what you caught to the government. That was how it worked. So they would be flying the Turkish flag, and the Turkish flag would be at peace with the Americans. But if they saw the American ship was defenseless, they'd take down the Turkish flag, put up the Tripoli flag, and then go to war. So all those things were going on. So now I guess the final point is with Richard Summers, someone who was so smart, and by the way, I was talking about John Barry. So he knew that sooner or later America would have to build a navy and take on these terrorists. And so he worked with George Washington. They tried to get the money to do that. And he, according to Bill Kelly, that John Barry actually was the headmaster of that school that Richard Summers and Charles Stewart and Stephen Decatur went to. So it wasn't like it was coincidence they all happened to be at the same school. It was almost as if John Barry was preparing the new Navy and was picking out the brightest and the sharpest people who took an interest in sailing and was shaping the American Navy. And I think that theory makes a whole lot of sense. All right, so anyway, when you learn about Richard Summers, how smart he was, how careful he was, how experienced he was, how well trained he was, why would he do something so reckless as to bring that explosive-laden ship into Tripoli Harbor on a suicide mission? And what we all have our own theories, no one knows for sure. But another thing that was happening, at the same time, remember, Thomas Jefferson was the one who led America into this war 5,000 miles away. Because for 20 years, Thomas Jefferson knew that sooner or later we had to take on these Muslim pirates. But okay, not pirates, privateers. But then, suddenly, 4 years into the war, something else happened in Thomas Jefferson's life. What was it? It turned out he was afraid that America was too weak because the French and the Spanish owned the western part of America. And he had a unique opportunity in December of 1803 to get rid of that threat. What was that? To buy Louisiana and double the size of the country. The minute that happened during the summer of 1804, America suddenly was interested in protecting that new territory, exploring that new territory, defending that new territory. And everybody knew it would be difficult for America to fight a war 5,000 miles away and to hold on to that Louisiana territory. So my feeling is the Navy officers knew that if they didn't decisively win the war at that time, they would be called back before their job was done, and all the work and all the sacrifice they had done for 4 years in fighting those Muslim terrorists would be washed down the drain. And I think it was that act of desperation, one gamble to do the job. And although the mission did not succeed, although it was a failure, and Richard Summers died, what happened was it so impressed Europe, it so impressed our Muslim enemies, that within 10 or 15 years, the game changed completely. That suddenly snatching innocent people on the high seas and holding them for slavery or ransom was no longer acceptable, and we had 180 years of peace with the Muslim world. I think that's the real lesson of Richard Summers. The final thing, I see I've gotten a little bit long, but to pay for all that stuff that we put on social media to talk about Richard Summers, we have to pay for it somehow, so we're having a little fundraiser for Liberty and Prosperity over at Sandy Point right after we leave here. It was supposed to be Gregory's, by the way, but it's a little too smoky right now, I believe, for Gregory, so I just want to thank Sandy Point for filling in. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm moving to the back wall, and it will be a little shorter. The back wall first shows the sister of Richard Summers, Sarah Keene Summers, and there's a lot of interesting relationships with who she married. And she's holding a ring. We heard the story of the one ring where they divided it into three among the friends. The ring that she's holding was given to Richard by George Washington. There's two possible reasons why George Washington gave him this special ring. And in the center of the ring is actually hair from George Washington, covered over by like a glass bubble. One reason is that possibly Washington, as commander-in-chief, gave Richard the ring to persuade him to join the new Navy, and he did join in 1798. And the second reason is that Summers was involved in the North Atlantic in what was called the Quasi-War. We've never discussed that here. In 1798, and it might have been given to him as a token of appreciation by George Washington. Three of those rings were made, and one of them was given to Richard Summers. It is in the museum in Philadelphia. Another vignette on the back wall is the family cemetery. It's called the Colonel Richard Summers Burial Ground, and it's located in New York Avenue School. It was there before the school was built, and actually the school there is the second school. So that property was used as the family burial ground, and we actually do have his mother, father, brother, sister, infant niece, and nephew that are buried there. If Richard Summers if his remains had been returned to Summers Point, he would have been buried there. So that's why that is included on the back wall. Another significant thing on the back is the Tripoli Monument. This has a very interesting history. It's the oldest military monument in the United States. And David Porter, who later became a Commodore in the U.S. Navy and also was in the Navy at the time of Richard Summers, he was the first lieutenant on the Philadelphia, which is on the front wall. He conceived the idea to honor the 6 officers that were killed in the First Barbary War. So he solicited dues from other officers in the Navy, $20 apiece, to help design and build the monument. So the monument was built, it was shipped to the United States, used as ballast on the U.S. Constitution when it was brought here. And it was first placed in the United States Navy Yard, which is where the Vice President of the United States lives. And so that was the first location for it. Then it was burned in the burning of Washington in the early 1800s. And then it was moved in front of the Capitol. So that Tripoli Monument was in front of the Capitol. And then later it was moved onto the grounds of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. So if you go to Annapolis, it's a very prominent statue there. And if you notice, it's the names of the officers who died in the First Barbary War. And the last vignette on the back is the Old Protestant Cemetery. So after the crew members died, they were buried along the shore outside the castle walls, along the beach, and that's where they remained for decades. None of them were ever returned to the United States. Some of the crew members from the Philadelphia were able to go out there to bury them after the bodies had been drugged through the streets of Tripoli and fed to wild dogs. That's the disrespect that the Tripoli pirates had for the American soldiers, that they dragged them through the streets and dogs ate off of the bodies. So they were first buried along the shore, and then around 1830, they were discovered, and they were moved. Some of them were moved in a small area up on a hill, and then that started to form the Old Protestant Cemetery. At one time, diplomats from the United States, England, France, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Switzerland, they started using that as their own diplomatic cemetery. If they had a family member die, they were buried there. So that there was a number of different countries that used that cemetery. In 1949, the United States Navy accepted the Old Protestant Cemetery as the final resting place for the officers and for the crew members. As far as we know, there's 5, possibly 6 crypts that are located there that have them buried. As far as we know, too, the 3 officers were buried in separate graves. They were able to identify them from buttons on their uniforms, parts of their uniform that were still intact at the time. The men that were not officers were buried into mass graves. cemetery was left in great disrepair for many, many decades. And in 1949 or so, the wives of the ambassadors went into the cemetery and started to fix it up some, but it still was okay for a while, disrepair. We have a lot of pictures of that in the museum. And in 2006, at the request of the Richard Summers family members, some letters were sent, and the Libyan Ministry of Antiquities opened up the graves. They confirmed that there definitely are some remains left. They asked for history of the kinds of buttons and fabric that they would be on the uniforms, and they saw that some of that was intact, so that we know that they are the American soldiers. So that's why those 3 grave sites on the back wall are included. On a personal level, from the Summers Point Historical Society and also on the Arts Commission, I really want to thank everyone who's attended today and everyone who was able to be a part of this. I do have, if you want to see me afterwards, there's a brochure called The Trail of Richard Summers. We have many Summers family sites that are still located here in Summers Point. And we did skip over one part of the program, so we're going to do that now.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sally Hastings, and the nice thing about this brochure, it says, a short history of Summers Point, just to let you know.